Okay. Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Darren Moore. I'm the current president of the Virginia Executive Institute Alumni Association, and welcome you to today's talk with Dr. Robert Winn. Before I introduce Dr. Winn and allow him to share some knowledge and insights with us this morning, I would like to ask Tyshawn to say a few words on behalf of CMA, and again, thank her and the CMA organization as well for continuing to partner with VEIA in spreading leadership training and development opportunities across Virginia. So Tyshawn, would you like to say a few words?
Just would like to say good morning. Good morning to everyone, especially my CMA members. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for VEIAA for inviting us for today's presentation with Dr. Winn. I'm looking forward to it. And I'm also looking forward to a new year, a new fiscal year, and looking forward to serving all of you again in terms of presenting training and leadership skill building. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tyshawn. I echo what you say as well, as far as the partnership that we've been able to encourage between the two associations. And to the VEI alumni members, I look forward to, hopefully, as we continue throughout this year, of possibly being able to network in person again and share some knowledge and insights with each other in that format as well, which I know we all look forward to. So with that, I'll say a few words about Dr. Robert Winn, who is the director of the VCU Massey Cancer Center, who oversees a cancer center designated by the National Cancer Institute that provides additional cancer care, conducts groundbreaking research to discover new therapies for cancer, offers high quality education and training, and engages with the community to make advancements in cancer treatment and prevention equally available to all. Dr. Winn is leading the nation in establishing the 21st century model of equity for cancer science and care, in which the community is informing and partnering with Massey on its research to best address the cancer burden and disparities of those cancer center serves, with a local focus on the global impact as well. In addition to directing the activities at Massey's 250 plus research members, scientists, and physicians from 39 different departments and 9 different colleges and schools at VCU, he also manages a research laboratory at VCU. As also Dr. Winn, as a pulmonologist, he is committed to community engaged research centered on eliminating health disparities. And I will say there's a lot more that I could say about Dr. Winn, and hopefully many of you have had the chance to read up on some of his accomplishments and experiences. But I think what I look forward to most about today is not only some examples of his innovative leadership in cancer research, which I will say from a personal standpoint is near and dear in terms of looking for opportunities to move past the impacts that disease has on families, but also Dr. Winn's examples of leadership in our current climate and what we have all engaged over the last 14 to 16 months with regards to COVID-19. And I'm sure, like many of you, we are looking for examples of leadership, innovative leadership, and leadership that is not only adaptive, but inspirational in this current time. And as we move out of COVID-19 and try to return to some form of normalcy, but also to a new world for the state employee as well. So with that, Dr. Winn, I can't thank you enough for agreeing to join us today and share your insights. And I will at this time turn it over to you to talk with us about what you have experienced. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and Darren, Tyshawn, and James, and the rest of the committee. I just want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to share a conversation with you all. People frequently sort of say, well, you know, we've gone through a really rough year, and I keep saying we have, but as we're coming out of this rough year, what's becoming increasingly clear is our ability as people, individuals living in the state of Virginia, to be able to, and I mean this with no hyperbole, to be able to lead the country out of this past into our new future. And I mean that. Now, this is a little bit, for those of you who are old enough who remember the Billy Preston song, Will It Go Around in Circles? And you may famously remember, I got a song, it ain't got no melody, but I'm gonna sing it for my friends. Well, in this context of looking about leadership, I'm not going to present a whole bunch of data to you. Instead, what I am going to do is try to integrate how we learn from history and how that evidence of history plays out to us today. One might say, well, what does a cancer center director, he's a cancer center director, he's going to be, focused on cancer 24/7. And it is true. Just like Martin Luther King, I too have a dream. My dream is clear. One, to eradicate all cancer off the face of the planet. But my second is to eradicate disparities wherever I see them. And I'm unapologetic about that. It was not lost on me that in 2019, when I got chosen to be, of all places, the cancer center director here at VCU Massey, that it wasn't just a personal thing of my becoming a cancer center. I understood the historical nature of what was happening as well. I also think there were some people within the state who clearly understood that my becoming then the only African-American cancer center director of VCU Massey in Richmond was not lost on many. Now, let me just tell you, so I'm just being upfront and clear, that I have roots here. Now, my grandmother grew up here in the 1930s and 40s, and she's 95. You'll see her hopefully at the end of this talk. I always have a picture of my grandmother because she and my grandfather were the most important. But my grandmother, actually, when I was thinking about programs to end up in, looked at Stanford, looked at UAB, she said something to me that actually stuck with me to this day. She said, if them folks want you in Richmond, and you can do something good in Richmond. She goes, you know what? She goes, you're going to do something that I've been trying to do my whole life and hoping my whole life. She goes, I never thought that I would, first of all, see that there'd be any person of color, Black folk, she used those language, that would ever be ahead of that cancer center, let alone in Richmond. And she goes, and that it's my baby. She goes, I will send up as many prayers as you need. And so she had a prayer circle. I'm just being honest with y'all. Before I came here, but her biggest prayer wasn't so much that I did great, but that Richmond, by my presence of being here and by the work that we would do, would be seen differently than what she recognized Richmond when she grew up. And I thought that was powerful. It wasn't about my doing great. It was really about what we could do and how other people could see Richmond and the greater parts of Virginia. That is the context of what this conversation is going to be. The way forward and our opportunity to lead the country into doing something that I think that we're coming out of one of the most painful times in history. But I honestly believe that by our movements and our thoughtful movements and leadership ahead, that we'll be able to lead the country to a better day. So I'm going to share my screen with you, if you don't mind. And please excuse my excitement, because every time this works, I'm just so impressed. I mean, listen, I may be smart, but I am technologically challenged with this. And my son reminds me of that all the time. So let me talk about why in leadership, in my assessment, structure and the awareness of the structure that you're dealing with and trust matter. We've had a bold, brash idea that when I talk about this cancer center, I'm not only talking about the importance of it in the context of the new drugs it will discover and the new science it will bring forth, but how that gets actually and impacts our communities. So it's not as sexy as Carl Benz, who came up with the first combustible engine. And I recognize that. This talk is much more probably aligned with Henry Ford and the Dodge brothers about how do we get this amazing cutting edge stuff out to more people. And what I've learned in the context of leaders is that I've seen a number of them, but I have been reminded by a person who I have great respect for, and which is Donald Berwick, who was a former director of the CMS and has done amazing things. He's just an amazing human being who reminds us all that when values are strong, rules are unnecessary. But when values are weak, rules tend to be insufficient. And this is a riff off of Emil Durkheim, who talked about this with Mores. And I come back to this because when I think of leadership, I think of not only my growth in the context of scientific leadership with, the likes of having Francis Collins, who's my genetics teachers back at University of Michigan, to my clinical development with folks like Dr. Petty and other people who really have done a wonderful job in allowing me to become a good physician. But I think about those other leaders that have been in my life, like Elijah Cummings and John Lewis, as well as other folk, Danny Davis and Bobby Rush. But these two men in particular, when I was a young, growing administrator, cancer center director back in Illinois, actually were the two who told me that reminded me that even if I came up with the cure for cancer, if that cure is only available to some and not all, then I've only done half my job. And both of them were very fierce in their making certain that I know that, and that was part of my mentorship and my growth. As many of you all know, both also succumbed to cancer. So for me, when I say that I want to make sure that we fight cancer and that we are able to make the big C into a smaller c, it's personal. Having said that, I recognize that big ideas come from big leaders, and sometimes big ideas come from leaders that may not, at least in the beginning, seem that they work together, but are able to find an alignment around a common interest. I show you this not only to celebrate the fact that we're coming up on the 50th anniversary on the war on cancer that was started in 1971, that allowed for a place like VCU Massey and UVA to become what I call deputized extensions of the federal government, meaning that we are NCI, National Cancer Institute designated cancer centers, of which we have 2 in the state. But I show you this picture because it reminds you that it was not Nixon's alone that got this done. In fact, the person right behind Nixon's right shoulder is probably the person most credited with being able to get this war on cancer aligned and being able to establish the NCI designated cancer center, and that's Ted Kennedy. Now, both men didn't see eye to eye on many things, but at least on this, they both agreed that they can lay down their differences and work with scientists and other policy people to do something that was big, bold, and robust. If COVID's not taught me anything else, it's that the reality is that we did more through COVID faster, quicker, and better when we recognized that 60% of the reasons why we weren't working with other people didn't have anything to do with anything external, it was just us. And I'm reminded by this picture of other things too, that there are no women here, no women scientists, they're not even public health officials in this picture. This is what I keep thinking about what we did for the first 50 years. And yes, we've come up with miracle drugs, no doubt about it. Immunotherapy drugs, molecular targeted therapy drugs. But I want to reimagine 2 big ideas here at VCU Massey. And the first is I want to reimagine what cancer centers can do for the next 50 years in extending our ability beyond just the creation of new drugs and new approaches to actually really thinking about population health and population science. And the second, not lost on me, is that I don't think most people understand that we have something incredibly special in Virginia. We have only the second safety net hospital, and I mean safety net hospital in the entire country, with both a clinical translational science and an NCI designated centers. Both academic centers that are bringing not only cutting edge research, but the potential of having that research be what actually turns into care and impacting policy for the future. I'm proud of that. And so while I tell you that I want to reimagine how new cancers, how an NTI designated cancer center can move forward in 50 years. My second goal is to reimagine what a safety net hospital can actually do when it's enhanced and augmented by academics and by the involvement of government. We've made some significant strides, certainly, in cancer disparities throughout the entire United States. In the 1990s, the Black-white death from cancer was 33%. It's now down to 14%, but that's not to say we've made it. I put together the first report with the American Association of Cancer Research, which had its very first health disparities report that we were able to present to Congress about a year ago. I'm also co-chairing now the second version of that should be out in 2022. But one of the glaring things that actually we looked at a glance was that, yeah, we're making some progress, but in some areas we're not making any progress. And in some areas we're even losing ground. The difference between prostate and breast cancer between Black-white is still significant. The fact that we know that Latino kids and adolescents are more likely to develop leukemia and die from it, and the fact, by the way, that where you live matters. We know that men living in Kentucky have a much higher rate of getting lung cancer and dying from lung cancer, about 3.5 times higher than those men, same men living in Utah. And interestingly enough, we've also identified that bisexual women who are 70% more likely, get this, to be diagnosed with a life-ending cancer than heterosexual women. So when I think of disparities, typically anytime we have health disparities, and I can tell even when I talk about health disparities now, that there are some people whose eyeballs roll in the back of their heads, or they say it's a soft science. Well, I don't know if you've been around long enough to sort of see the Bugs Bunny sort of cartoons, but when he said, I'm going to make rabbits, right? The reality is I'm bringing sexy back to health disparities. In fact, not only am I bringing sexy back to health disparities, I am actually challenging everyone to recognize that this is the new science that will really have the biggest impact in how we move forward. Why? I'll point out to you that in 2018, I had recently done a talk in Norway, and I pointed out a study to the folks in Norway that they too have disparities in neighbors. It was a head scratcher, and one of the biggest guys from one of the biggest institutions says, well, what are you talking about? And in fact, went to a 2017, 2018 paper and showed them that in Norway, in some parts of Norway, there's a 10-year life expectancy gap. In fact, the funny part about that is that everyone was confused. They were like, well, Norway is one of the most homogeneous places on the planet. How could we have a disparities gap, Rob? When I presented them with the data, it was clear. But what that gave me an example to explain to them as I explained to you, which is why I'm so excited that when you talk about big ideas, the rumble under your feet that you may be feeling right now is that we have several big ideas happening right here, right now in Virginia. Reimagining what safety net hospitals can do, reimagining what an NCI designated cancer, but actually putting a framework to that disparities isn't some sort of second-rate thing or only for minorities. Disparities matter because ultimately what disparities allow you to do is to make the observation, and then it allows you to ask those questions about why that gap exists, ultimately to come up with interventions. This look on health disparities, you might sort of say, well, of course that, well, yeah, right. But that is not the language or the framework many of us have actually gone about with this work when all of us should be involved in disparities. This is not an exclusive act of any kind. This is why I start off with that I have two dreams, one to eradicate cancer, but the other is absolutely to eradicate disparities wherever they exist, whether they be in Martinville, Danville, Lawrenceville, wherever. I talk about this because I know very well that while we have amazing science and we have had scientific miracles, and I'll come up with this again, this will be a recurring theme, it sometimes falls short. Science in and of itself is a wonderful practice of being able to do reductionists and coming up with these amazing sort of therapies, but the therapies require people to trust and to also trust the system. And Denise Grady and I have also written about this issue around, we have these miracle drugs, and yet there remains a divide, in this case, an immunotherapy divide, in which some people were getting these miracle saving drugs and others were not. I want to tell you that while I love science, and people have heard me say this, and God knows if loving science is wrong, I straight up do not want to be right. I love science. I love basic translational science. But I'm not so foolhardy and so naive to not understand that the vast majority of contributions to chronic diseases, whether they be cancer or other things, are rooted in behaviors and environmental exposures. In 1989, Dr. Border once famously said, poverty is a carcinogen. The truth of the matter is we all know that with obesity and lack of exercise and alcohol consumption and pollution and many other facts, and we'll come back to this, that some of these behaviors, that cancer should not only be screened and treated, but cancer should be prevented. The question becomes, I know that this is hard, but the truth of the matter is, it was interesting when Kennedy said, well, we know going to the moon is hard, but we do it because it's hard. I think we have to get a renewed sense of how many people we can save just from giving the standard of care and putting in prevention measures. And that seems to be such a small thing, but it is paradigm shifting if we believe it and if we implement it. COVID, to no surprise, hit us hard and exposed a number of issues that were not just unique to us here in Virginia, but throughout the United States. And that is that we had disparities. All of us remember George Floyd. I don't think any of us could forget that moment, because it was for the first time the public to sort of see on display that you couldn't turn away from the TV set. And by the way, because of the pandemic, we were at home and watched. When we literally saw the 8 minutes and 46 seconds when someone's life was extinguished right in front of us. Now, I don't want to just focus on the George Floyd because there's many other things, but I do want to say this on a personal level. This is one of the issues I actually had because like recently where you had the young man being pulled over at a gas station, essentially DWB, driving while black, the Army officer. The only two times in my life I've ever had guns pulled out on me have been at the hands of the police. Now, before you say anything about Dr. Winn, Rob, I know what are you talking about? The reality is I want to let you know that I have had family members, including my brother, who is the closest to me, who just retired actually from the force. So I'm not talking anything negative about policing. All I'm asking for is better policing. And in fact, my brother spent almost his entire career until he recently retired, trying to actually encourage better policing in New York State. I say all this to say that as we start thinking about things that just happened, let's stop thinking about these things as leaders in the context of what happened, but understand that the past and now, right, are connected. And in fact, as we think about these disparities things, it just keeps happening. As I mentioned, the young Army officer who was pulled over for essentially DWB, I have had PTSD around this exact situation because I had this exact situation on a personal level. So yeah, when people say, well, what's your goal as a cancer center director and why are you thinking about all these things? It's because ultimately, I want to just be transparent that all of these things, the structure, the food you eat, lack thereof of transportation, these issues around gun violence, or these issues in this case around just this ridiculousness, all have a way also, these lived experience of impacting our biology. Gone are the days where I think that you can just rely on a scientist to, quote, keep us healthy. Wellness and healthiness is really going to be much more sophisticated as we move forward, which is why I think that when we come back to this concept of leaders, we need to actually get leaders from different fields to understand, as James Brown would say, how do we get on the one? Or for those who know Bootsy Collins, how do we understand that there is common convergence of many of these things and bringing together policy folk and bringing together folks from education and bringing together folks from the health field and bringing together business people to understand that all these things contribute to structure. So if we're able to understand the structure and the convergence of those structures, we just might have a fighting chance of actually making some impact. It's important for all of us to know that there's a little Amy in all of us. Now, I know that there's someone listening to this and seeing this and going to listen. I mean, that's for other folks. I am not. Listen, I want to be the first to tell you that Amy Cooper, if you looked at her lived experience, was not a racist. That's why it's important to know and to be conscious that the truth of the matter is that this was a weak moment. In fact, I've gone and learned more from the Amy Cooper story. Many of you know Christian Cooper was an African-American, Harvard grad, avid bird watcher, who during the height of all this craziness post-Floyd, Amy Cooper called the cops on, knowing what full well could happen because of her dog, where Christian Cooper's like, listen, you're in New York, you're in Central Park, put your freaking dog on a leash. Look at that dog. And at a moment of poor judgment, she called the police. Why do I use that? I think that if nothing that comes out of COVID is that whether you're from Danville, Martinville, Petersburg, Richmond, Fairfax, wherever, all of us have to recognize that there's a potential of little Amy in all of us. Why? Because racism and structure and all of us, these things is not so much a personal failure as it is a systemic and structural one. And we have to recognize that the structure impacts us whether we know it consciously or unconsciously, even in science. I want to talk about this because it matters that leaders, and one of the things I'm learning over the time, that I think good leaders and leaders in particular know history. And I say that because I think that sometimes we have this thing where we're doing a lot and we're having a lot of activities, but those activities ultimately wind up in a lot of heat, but no real action, because we're not tethered to the context of the historical nature of these things. Why do I say this? Because ultimately we act as if health disparities just came on the scene yesterday. The definitive paper was written by W.E.B. Du Bois in 1899. Called the Philadelphia Papers. He's one of the giants in the field of social sciences and one of certainly the giants in among African Americans in the social sciences who created and defined health disparities back in the day in 1899, the differences in the literacy, crime, poverty, poor housing, all the rest of these. Sounds familiar? What we should also recognize is that by understanding and having grace and a little bit of humility as leaders, we understand that we're not the first that this has ever happened to. Sometimes the language now, well, COVID and Rodney, and all this stuff with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, understand that in 1918, with the flu pandemic of 1918, we lost, same respiratory type issue, 675,000 people alone in the United States. But also know that the greatest number of African Americans killed in the United States during one single period was during that 1918 to 1921. Now, most of you just are starting to hear about the Tulsa massacres, but many of you probably don't know that in places like Elaine, Arkansas, we lost almost 200 people in a 48-hour period. Almost 100 people or so in Chicago, and Philadelphia, in DC. This issues of the racial unrest during the period of a pandemic is new. And I think we make the mistake of actually just focusing on the now and not understanding the context, the structures, and the history in which these things exist. Because I think with grace and humility, the understanding of history, you start figuring out, how do we make those same mistakes? I've said this before, and I'll say it again. When it comes to eradicating disparities, one of the elements of this is just like a diet. In fact, there's data now, undisputable data, that says that everybody knows that there are significant benefits to weight loss. And everybody knows that there's 500 or even 1,000 or more different ways of losing weight if you chose one. Not debatable. It doesn't really matter what diet you use. If you stuck and committed to one, you get results in losing weight. And that the biggest issue of people not losing weight isn't that they were on the wrong diet, it's they simply weren't committed to it. It's not that we don't know what health disparities are. It's not that we don't know what the benefits are. One of the immediate benefits is that a stronger, tighter United States and the appearance of actually togetherness actually also is a notable state of other people that live even outside the United States of our strength. We know that there's multiple benefits that could be described of if we were to reduce disparities, what the outcomes would be. We also know from the Rumsfeld Fair Housing Act dating all the way back to the 60s, 70s, 80s, and even the early 2000s, mid 2000s, that we have definite plans in place that when they were implemented could even show success. The issue is we don't know what health disparities are or don't know the benefits. It's simply we have not been committed. So I submit to you that as we move forward in leadership, it's not enough just to come up with great ideas. It's not enough just to actually come up with the blue ribbon panel and then have a wonderful policy in place. At some point, we got to get real and stop playing and understand that now I have to move, even me, from a perspective of just academic excellence of publishing data and thinking data is going to actually, or science is just going to do something without its connectedness to people, we fall short. So I'm now pushing for an academic relevant life. I'll still publish, I'll still get grants, and I'll still have my team do that. But one of the things, the elements are, what is the actual impact of our work in the communities? I understand that this makes people feel uncomfortable. In fact, unfortunately, a colleague of mine just recently got into a lot of hot water just simply because he just wasn't thoughtful. He essentially said on JAMA podcast recently, well, physicians can't be racist. And that even worse, which I wish you would have stopped, but he didn't. He said, repeatedly, well, structural racism isn't really racism, and that term just alienates white folk. Let's understand the history. The history does involve things like Marion Sims, who was the early father of modern day surgical gynecology, who used Black women exclusively for his experiments because he thought they didn't have pain receptors. It's true. And why do I say this? I say this because science and our policies are good, but they are not enough if we don't have trust. And there's no better example than our recent example of when Operation Warp Speed, where it was a miracle, near a miracle. Not that the mRNA vaccine got created. Come on, you all know that mRNA vaccine was starting to be worked on during the height of the AIDS period back in the 80s from folks at UPenn. The only difference was that the tools and the technology we had then didn't allow the mRNA vaccine to be fully realized until 2006, 2008. So it wasn't a miracle that we had an mRNA vaccine. It was a miracle that we were able to operationalize it, pull it off the shelf, and get it out in the field so early. You all know that there was mistrust, misinformation, distrust around that whole issue. And most of us were scratching our heads and sort of saying, well, we have these vaccines, we're getting out, it's historic. What the hell's wrong with people? Why are they hesitant? What do you mean, why are they hesitant? To be a good leader, as I'm telling everyone here at Massey, not only do you show at least a little bit of humility of understanding history, but some grace and understanding. Many of those same people who show and demonstrate hesitancy have a reason. There was something called the United States Public Health Study of 1932, AKA the Tuskegee Studies. There was the Henrietta Lacks. There were things on which we're taking, Native American tribes and taking their research and making lots of money off of them without actually involving them at all. So stop us playing. Part of good leadership isn't just the bright ideal, isn't just the, I'm going to get this done come hell or high water, isn't just, I'm going to make this policy. Part of great leadership, as my grandmother keeps reminding me, is having the grace and humility to listen. And when we're able to listen to our communities, it enables us to come up with, I think, better processes. It's true that many of our health systems, this is just a Cleveland clinic, but you can put almost anything, grow healthier while its neighbors stay sick. In fact, most of the communities where things in health systems are going stronger, most of their communities, maybe even blocks away, still remain in poverty. Now, I understand that not everyone can be helped at all times, and that, this is mom apple's pie and everything, and this is sort of the aspirational aspects. But listen, as Daniel Burnham once sort of said, make no small plans, because small plans, not only do they not stir the hearts of people, but they usually don't get accomplished. Make big plans, because big plans actually will stir the imagination. And ultimately, even if we don't succeed, we've actually done something better. This is where I lay down my stake. As leaders in Virginia and leaders throughout, how can we do things differently? I am pushing with every breath in my body that the reality is academic centers and government, and we've all focused on lots of downstream factors, but I think we've now reached the point where we understand that just focusing on downstream factors alone will do us some good, but even more good will become when we understand the upstream factors. And I'll end with the following, just in the last couple of minutes. History matters. History matters. The two biggest things that I'll talk to you about real quick are about redlining, called the Federal Housing Act of the 1930s, which literally was the first act in some very structured and formal ways, segregating communities. This is a map of Chicago. But the other one was called the Urban Renewal, or the Slum Clearance Program, as it was better known. Now, as a result of these acts, first, the Federal Housing Act of the 1930s, in Chicago, you still have the segregation on the south and west sides. Interestingly enough, you have the life expectancy difference X number of decades from the 30s that actually still mimic that separation. I give you this example from Steve Wolf, where in the Loop, which is the area of Magnificent Mile, I mean, if you've ever been to Chicago, if you haven't, put it this way, this is where Keanu Reeves and Oprah Winfrey would go back to. That area, the life expectancy is 85. If you literally go 4 miles to the west, the life expectancy decreases by 16 years. West Garfield Park is 69. And if you go literally, I swear to you, 8 miles south of the Loop, which is the area called Inglewood, where Bernie Mac and Derrick Rose and others have come from, I mean, a hard hit area in the South Side, it's a 30-year difference. And I say that and use this for Chicago, but the same thing goes here in Richmond and in Sarria. So this is what the Federal Housing Act redlining of the 1930s looked like in Virginia, circa 1935. And I just want you to pay attention to the context of the blue and the green, which is areas where the congregations of whites were, or people who could get homes in that area, and the red and the yellow are areas which were no-go, obviously concentrations of African Americans on the east and versus west. I want to show you this because the truth of the matter is that even despite segregation, right, there were these robust communities. In fact, Jackson Ward, as many of you know, was called the Harlem of the South. But I do want you to know that while you had the first act, federal act of segregation, the death blow to many of these communities weren't because they were bad communities. It's because we had something that we thought was good, leadership, right? You couldn't think what was the impending impact on all the communities. This was a period where we were building through the 50s and 60s and 70s, where famously we were building white roads through black bedrooms. And as a result of what we consider to be, in some cases, the urban renewal or getting rid of some slums, you were actually getting rid of very robust communities as well. Let's be real. That history, as we talk about social determinants of health, which has become a buzzword these days, let's talk about social determinants of health more like an Ornette Coleman, in that there are multiple levels that are happening at the same time. The structure and history that created this and where we have now, and then as a result of the social determinants of needs, the impact on individual needs. We understand that those most vulnerable communities, as a result of two of those both federal acts, led at-risk communities to actually be the reposit or the place where we put many of our factories and waste sites. We also understand that at the end of the day, what we're learning now is that as a result of those practices and history and policies, we not only understand that we're getting more cancers, but we're getting more cancers related to those areas. There's something called particulate matter 2.5, which we now definitively know disproportionately and systemically affect people of color, living, interesting enough, in historically those red zones, if you would. We also know that we have this concept of heat islands that are also contributing to disease. This is a picture of Baltimore, just the top level, just showing the areas that are the suburbs of Baltimore. The picture at the bottom right is an area called South Baltimore, which is a really gentrified area that's actually coming up, and plants and all the rest of that. And then you have Franklin Square. I only say this to tell you that this directly relates to two things. The particulate matter 2.5 turns out are where you're putting more of your factories, where you have more of your roads. But interestingly enough, this is a really kind of interesting sort of point that I've just come to be aware of these heat islands, that the poorest areas, typically not just in Virginia and in Baltimore and these areas, but around the country, the poorest areas tend to be the hottest, have the hottest temperatures. And that, you would say, who cares? But in some cases, the 8 to 7 degrees in differences are also costing and contributing to disease. And so as your income comes up, right, you're able to live in areas where you have much more protection from UV, much more protection. Why? Because again, let's go back to the history, right? This red line. Let's remember, I'm going to show you a point now in Gilpin Court, which is back in that Jackson ward on our east end. And then I'm going to show you all an area that was actually to the west. Two neighborhoods. If you look at why one area of town, and in fact, this now correlates. So I'm showing you these pictures, but we now have data that looks at all of these cities and can look at these 8-degree difference. If you look at Gilpin Court, where is the vegetation? Where are the trees? Where are the canopy, right? Of things that would block the UV, of keep the heat from raising so hot. This is not just shown on the East End. This is shown in Franklin Square and other parts of Baltimore. You can go to Philadelphia and have the same issue, right? So why would a cancer center director be interested in the environment? Because it turns out that the vegetation, the canopies of trees and all the rest of that, not only does it block UV, but also the degrees, right, of being less hot actually turns out can be a impact on your biology in a way, in your DNA, that actually promotes more protective genes than it does stimulate the genes that would cause cancer. Now, listen, I think race, we can talk about race in the DNA, but the reality is that you're a zip code and neighborhood of association. In my mind, that is much more predictive than your DNA. And one way of looking at that is that the place and space and the environment and the interactions that you have every day are the things that impact your biology. So if you use race as for a second, let's suspend that race differences are biological. Let's think about the outcomes of bad diseases are essentially related to place and space. As leaders, that's something we could do something about. Again, whether it's in poor white areas, poor Black areas, it doesn't really matter. I'll end with this and saying that on the science front, we've done so great, but when it comes to our communities, this push for bigger data has unfortunately made some of our communities invisible. And those omics within the community, I think, are going to be as valuable as any of the other data that we're collecting. And I think in an interest of time, I'm going to just stop there and essentially just say that we need to have more and better data for our communities. And I'm leading the charge on not just getting data for scientists, but getting data in a way that we could take back to our politicians so that in our, people who run our districts and the state reps all the way to the council members, because most of the time they are unaware of, in this case, the cancer health of their communities. I think we can work together. I'll end by sort of saying that this matters and that community matters to me, and that one of the things that came out of this was a humbling experience of understanding that with the death of Bishop Gerald Glenn, it wasn't that he was a bad person or just, who cared. God is larger than COVID-19. Many of you remember that. It was that we failed him. We didn't speak as one voice, as a science or medical community or any community. We allow misinformation, disinformation as leaders to run rampant so that good men and good people were confused. My small battle for that was that as the anchor institutions closed, the libraries, the schools, we then reached out to the community. And I have to say that today I'm most proud, or the thing that I'm most proud about, is not only that we got 2 drugs now that'll be coming to market, which I think is kind of hot for Massey Cancer Center. So I'm excited about that. But I'm equally excited that with Radine Mercer Haynes and Pastor Gray from the 5th Street Baptist Church, that we formed a team in which we now bring together every Friday facts and faith, that your faith is not at war with your facts, and that there are facts to be reckoned with. Every week, we bring internal and external experts in a way so that we're developing now, rebuilding trust, building back trust better in a way in which, just like my grandparents had to use the Greenbook to actually navigate things to be healthy, we're developing our own Greenbook on health. And so we are bringing in people like, and have brought in people like Dr. Fauci, who I like, and Jill Biden, because they see that we're trying to do something big here. We're trying to build bridges so that the critical disconnect between the discovery scientists, the implementation of those things, and the understanding and policies and things, and those policies and implementation hitting the community for real is actually happening. That's the big deal. And that's going to take leadership from not just the Cancer Center, not just me, but from all of us. So I'll end with this and just show you my grandmother. She will tell you she's from a place called Remlick. Where's Remlick? I will tell you that you from Richmond, you go through West Point, Virginia. Once you get through West Point, Virginia, you get on the other side of Middlesex, and apparently somewhere near Saluda is a little town called Remlick. That's where she's from. In fact, I tell her that now that she's turning about 95, 96, that I am about as proud of her as I've been of anything. And the fact that she has been a champion, not only for the family, but the champion of the all the older, more seasoned folks from wearing your mask and getting through COVID. And I'm here to tell you that, again, her mission of grace and humility has served me well, and hopefully it will serve us all well as leaders in the future. And I'll stop there and answer any questions. And I hope I haven't overstayed my welcome.
Not in the least. That was absolutely fantastic. And I love the passion and energy that you have, Dr. Winn, with this. You have put forth the best argument for public health is everybody's business. And we have several leaders on this call who are in a position to affect policy, who are have the ability to affect where roads are built, how roads are built. What can you say to them to remind them to put that filter on? And when we go, for instance, before City Council, and we look at innovations and development, who is being hurt in that development? And your examples from the 30s and the impact that that has today make a powerful argument for that. What should our state leaders be thinking when they impact policy as basically emissaries of public health?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And you know, it's the same criticism I have about academics, is that we have been not talking with one another at all. In fact, it's come up with something and do it now. I think that we have to maybe take a little bit of a pause and figure what additional voices should we be bringing to that table. And that really does take a level of humility and grace, because not everyone's going to come up with the same ideas, but the increased time it takes to talk with folks, I think, from the government, for people here, not only in the community, but from the academic centers, I think could be even more helpful. And so I'm hopeful that better, more richer conversations with more different voices around the table will help us. We're not going to be perfect, and we're still going to sometimes unintended consequences, but at least we'll be so much damn better than what I think some of the policies that have led to this have done by virtue of thinking about what's the impact.
There's a natural tendency to think that very often I'm in control of some things, and of course I'm not in control of things that I'm a victim of, and other people need to take care of themselves. And when you look at this data and you look at the systemic aspects of that, we see this thinking. In fact, I was just dealing with a difficult case the other day where it's like there's an ignorance or an unwillingness to accept the systemic aspects of this. And so I am a victim, but you are the problem, and that's how we often look at things. Any thoughts? Because when we deal with this psychological thing, I love how you talk about empathy and listening and the grace and the humility to listen. What do you recommend? How do we deal with some of these brick walls? When you look at this stuff, it breaks you down. You realize how systemic this is. How do we deal with that brick wall?
I've actually been thinking about this as what a wonderful opportunity we have to lead here right in Virginia and what we can actually do together. Interestingly enough, I think that there's more hesitancy in distrust and mistrust because they don't see unity amongst us. In fact, if you're smart people in your academic centers and you're smart people in the government and you're smart people around policies and you're smart people around other things, don't act as if we're actually having not exactly one voice, but at least as if we're working together. How the hell is someone in Danville going to trust already you all, particularly when they have competing interests now of other venues of getting information? So systemic, it exists. In fact, I keep telling people, let's stop talking. There are policies around race, but let's stop talking about race in the context of biology. Let's stop talking about, well, blacks are just different from whites. Let's start talking about the other issues of the policies and the places and spaces. And I think if we can actually have that argument, it takes a little bit more of the issue and puts it in a little bit more of a constructive way of saying, what can we do to impact and change the place and space that might have an impact on your overall health? But I think that we've done a lot of, well, Black people, COVID, and the only disagreement I ever had with Fauci, and he and I talked about it, he's laughed. He's a grouchy guy, but man, he's a crotchety guy, but he is funny as hell. I mean, I'll tell you that much, but he and I got into a debate about, I told him, I go, listen, Dr. Fauci, man, I really like you a lot and respect you have, but I go, when you talk about African Americans and their comorbid diseases, I go, you make it look as if they just have comorbid diseases. So you're really just talking about the biology, but you're not talking about the structure or even dealing with the issue of redlining and the implications of that, or the urban renewal issues. The PM 2.5s, that's not something that they did to themselves. That's, that is based on structures where they were getting exposed to more PM 2.5, which then we know causes lung cancer and increasing rates. So let's stop. I'm not saying it doesn't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because there's obviously going to be maybe some biological differences, but let's start putting our big boy and big girl pants on and big people pants on and started looking at these things more completely. That's what I hope we make movements in the future, which I think will help us be able to deal with more of the systemic issues.
And one of the first conversations I remember having with you, you made the most inclusive argument for health disparities I've ever heard. And that argument could be made from one tip of the state to the other, and certainly in travels around impoverished areas, predominantly white areas of the Southwest, the health disparities are immense. And like I said, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but how do you expand that inclusivity to health disparities so people who may think that doesn't apply to me realize, oh, yes, it does every day, especially when you look at the way impoverished people might heat their houses. Some things I have never seen in my life traveling around the Southwest before.
Oh, man. You know what? The funny part is when I went down to Beattyville, Kentucky, I said, you know what? I go, y'all just like South Side of Chicago. And they were like, what the hell? I go, the life expectancy difference in Beattyville, Kentucky versus Lexington is also 18 years difference. And so quit playing. The reality is where people live matters. And I think we have not actually had a bigger ideal about the impact of policies on where they live, what they're exposed to, what their stressors are. I think bringing that back to the table will help us actually, I think about more deeper policies that will have more long-lasting impact. And we're more alike than we are different. I mean, once people started recognizing, oh my God, and we start talking about quick fact that if you are a white guy living in Beattyville, Kentucky, you have a much more worse outcome than someone living in Utah, even in their rural areas. That was, I think, a point that most people were like, what the hell is that? Again, place and space matter.
Yeah, and that's a powerful argument that removes one from all sorts of things into a wider perspective. You have issued a tremendous challenge, and I think this is something we need to keep going, Darren, in the Alumni Association, for how our leaders in Virginia can impact policy through data, through all this information, just cuts through all the arguments that are out there and really shifts the focus in a different way. So Dr. Winn, I just want to thank you for sharing this with us. This intense presentation could have gone on a lot longer, and we will look forward to additional conversations as we support the work you're doing. We're so thrilled that you are at VCU. Those of us at VCU are very thrilled you're here, and we're just thrilled that you're with us in the Commonwealth. And we look forward to additional conversations with you. And with that, I turn it over to Darren to close.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Winn.
Yeah, thank you, Jim, and thank you, Dr. Winn, especially for what has been a great hour and great lunch and learn for everybody. And I will say, not too many people know where Beattyville, Kentucky is, but I, for one, do, and I can definitely appreciate the reference there, and as well as the reference to data. And as Jim mentioned there, obviously we want to focus on how we can leverage data to influence people in policy and inform others. And what you touched on today was right up that alley. And so I do appreciate those insights as well. And then obviously I appreciate the nature reference that you had, me standing outside right now in Kentucky, to give that a little bit more emphasis. I think it's something we all should take heed of as well. So Jim, thank you so much for facilitating, and VCU PMG's team, thank you so much as well for your help in facilitating this effort today. Thanks for all of you that were able to join. Thanks to Sean at CMA and your support and participation. And then again, Dr. Winn, thank you so much for sharing your insights and joining us today and supporting the VEI and the CMA efforts as well. So with that, we'll close today's event and look forward to more opportunities like this in the future. Thanks, everybody.